Hello, and welcome to Our Stories and Ourselves, a podcast about how our minds make stories and stories make us. My name is Kirsty, and in this show I talk about the stories we tell ourselves about the world, the stories we tell ourselves about history, and about how the way we think shapes these stories and shapes us. This episode I'm talking about polio, and the stories about it that led to panics, stories that led to changes in the way medicine was practiced, and stories about the vaccines. This may sound like a bit of a jumble, but stories and the way they shape our lives is a thread that I think pulls it all together. Even if I do go off on a few tangents, it does all come back to stories. I also promise I'll do my best to make sure it's not too depressing. So, polio has been talked about a fair bit lately, given the anti-vax sentiment of the new US Health and Human Services Secretary. This, along with the re-emergence of polio in Gaza, has brought the disease to the forefront of my mind. As well as the current human tragedy and risks around anti-vax sentiment, it also got me thinking about the story of Sister Kenny, who revolutionised polio treatment in the 1930s. It's an interesting story, in part because, somewhat like RFK Jr., she also challenged the medical establishment. However, unlike RFK Jr., she was right. I'll dig more into the difference later in the episode, as I think it's an important thing to explore. But first, I'm going to talk about what polio is, how people responded to it, and some of the stories of the illness. These are stories of those who survived it, the vaccine for it, and the ongoing journey to eradicate it, and the impact that some of these stories we tell about these things can have. Polio is caused by a virus that multiplies in the intestines and then attacks the nervous system, potentially causing paralysis. It attacks motor neurons, the nerve cells that transmit messages about movement through the body. How badly it damages these varies from person to person. But if half or more of the cells are damaged, the paralysis is permanent. The symptoms ranged from fever and headache to vomiting and stiffness. Patients sometimes have seizures and painful muscle contractions as the disease progresses through their body. The disease can also reach the brain, which is fatal. When drafting this script, I kept going back and forth between writing that description in the past tense and the present tense. For much of the world, polio is a thing from history, but as I'll get into later, it still hasn't been fully eradicated, so that's why there may be some weird tense changes at times. But back to polio. Sometimes the virus would attack the nerves in the lung muscles, and people would have to be shut in a machine called an iron lung to keep them breathing. Sometimes people would recover, but in other circumstances, their nerves would be too badly damaged and they would need assistance to breathe for the rest of their life. Anyone watching the current season of Call the Midwife will have seen these in one of the recent episodes. One man in the US, named Peter Alexander, lived in an iron lung for 70 years. It's quite a story of survival. After surviving polio and doing rehabilitation, he eventually learned a technique to breathe independently by gulping air into his lungs. It's a technique sometimes known as frog breathing. He found it hard at first, but after being promised a puppy if he could do it for 3 minutes, he achieved it. He eventually wrote a memoir about his experiences called 3 Minutes for a Dog, My Life in an Iron Lung. He was eventually able to breathe well enough to survive outside the iron lung for short periods, and went on to graduate from law school and work as a lawyer. As he aged, his muscles weakened, and he was confined to the iron lung again. He didn't let this stop him. He became a TikTok star and used his platform and his experiences to promote the importance of the vaccine. He was definitely someone who understood the power of stories. Understandably, polio epidemics in the early 20th century led to widespread fear. Cinemas, swimming pools, and even schools were closed, and thousands of people fled New York in fear of the disease when there was an outbreak. At one point, only nuclear war was considered more scary by US parents. It was particularly scary as a lot of the symptoms are similar to the flu and other common childhood illnesses, so it was hard to tell what someone was coming down with. It also varied in severity with no clear pattern, which made it even more unpredictable and scary. The UK Science Museum website has a powerful quote from Philip Roth in his novel Nemesis, where he describes the frightening symptoms. To quote, "Finally, the cataclysm began. The monstrous headache, the enfeebling exhaustion, the severe nausea, the raging fever, the unbearable muscle ache, followed in another 48 hours by the paralysis." End quote. With descriptions like that, panic was understandable. The British Polio Fellowship also has some stories from polio survivors. I'm going to quote from one by Sheila Gray. Quote, "It was a nice evening, so I'd had my tea and gone to play with friends in the park. But soon after getting there, I started to feel unwell. I went home and my mum put me straight to bed, presumably thinking a good night's sleep would sort me out. The next morning I woke and tried to get up and out of bed. I couldn't move my legs and fell to the floor. My mum called the doctor straight away, and he told her it was infantile paralysis, polio. Hearing those words back then must have been terrifying for a parent. An ambulance was called, and I was wrapped up in a big red blanket and taken to Liverpool Royal Children's Hospital. I remember they gave me some brown medicine and put me in a big hospital ward. While I was there, I tried to walk using a chair. There was a voice inside my head that just kept telling me to walk. I should walk, but I couldn't really do it. The polio virus left me weak from my waist down, particularly down my left side. Both my leg and my arm were weak. On my right side, my foot wouldn't flex. I had to walk on my tiptoes because I couldn't put my foot flat on the ground. Slowly I gained some strength back and was eventually allowed to go home. I left hospital with a full-length caliper on my left leg, but it was hard to walk. I couldn't bend my knee." End quote. She had surgery to improve the mobility in her leg and was able to live a fairly mobile life until her 50s, when post-polio syndrome became more evident. Again to quote, "By the time I reached 64, I couldn't really walk. I was struggling badly to move from A to B and would quickly get out of breath. I felt exhausted. I'd have to hold on to something because I just couldn't do it. About the same time, I also started to get pains in my back, which I'd never had before. I couldn't go anywhere. I couldn't travel abroad on holiday anymore. I had to stay in the UK and go somewhere flat. Nowadays, I can't walk without an aid. I have a frame for walking when I'm in the house. If I go outside, I use a walker, one I can sit on. My legs get very tired and I have to sit down." End quote. As I mentioned last episode, personal accounts like these can be very powerful. This story illustrates the long-term impact of the virus. Sheila's story, and others, are on the British Polio Fellowship website, which is linked, along with the rest of my sources, on the show website. These stories are particularly important as a lot of people, including medical professionals, are not familiar with the long-term impacts of polio, especially in those who have been doing fairly well for years. People see it as a disease of the past rather than the present. However, even those who fell ill a long time ago are living with the effects. The British Polio Fellowship is working to spread awareness of these long-term impacts. Before the polio vaccine was developed, there was nothing to do but let the illness run its course. Afterwards, people would have various treatments to address the weakness in their limbs caused by the disease, such as the breathing exercise I talked about with Peter Alexander. The conventional wisdom for a long time was to treat the muscular symptoms of polio with casts and splints. The understanding was that the damage came from the twitching, so limbs should be held rigid. Children, as it was usually children who caught it, were often immobilised in hospital beds in an attempt to limit the damage to their muscles. This was scary and painful for the kids and distressing for their families, but it was the standard medical practice at the time. However, in the 1930s, Sister Kenny, a self-taught nurse from Queensland, tried another approach. She had read in medical texts that heat could reduce muscle spasms and started treating the muscular symptoms of polio with heat packs, massage and movement. This was much more effective, but she faced an uphill battle to convince the medical establishment. For years she was ridiculed, despite showing good results from her treatment. There are even stories of parents hearing of the treatment and implementing it against medical advice. It took a long time for her treatments to become accepted, but eventually they were, and splints were no longer used to immobilise patients. Medicine was definitely different in the 1930s to what we have now. But is that the only difference between Sister Kenny and vaccine deniers? I would say no. One of the differences between this story and vaccine deniers who do their own research is what that research actually looked like. She based her theory on existing science. People already knew that heat could help with stiff muscles. She tested her theories and was willing to accept that she might be wrong. She also looked at the evidence for other treatments. While heat and massage were used to address the immediate effects of the disease, older techniques like calipers and splints were still used to help people walk. These were used when they worked, not thrown out completely. It's also interesting. I remember learning about Sister Kenny in school, and at the time it seemed like her approach was much kinder and gentler. My memory is of the story being important because of this, as well as it being a bit about the success of the underdog. However, reading about it while I was researching this episode, I'm not sure that was true. It sounded pretty intense and unpleasant. People, doing hours of hydrotherapy in a hot, uncomfortable pool. The simplified story I heard as a child didn't really capture the reality of the challenges of the disease and the grueling rehabilitation exercises. It does seem that even though it was effective, there was a bit of myth-making happening around Sister Kenny's interventions. I'll come back to this, but first I want to talk about vaccines. In 1954, Johannes Salk developed a polio vaccine. There was probably a team of researchers helping him who didn't get their names in the history books, but that's for another episode. Although he did also first test it on himself, so maybe not. Anyway, the vaccine used an inactive form of the virus administered by injection. It was licensed in 1955 in the US, and a mass vaccination campaign started. Thousands of children were vaccinated, and polio rates dropped dramatically. The fear that had driven cinemas to shut and people to flee cities faded away. 8 years later, Albert Sabin developed a vaccine which could be given orally. It was slow to be taken up in the US, but eventually was rolled out widely. It used a weakened live version of the virus. It's understandable that this could be scary, but the weakening of the virus worked and people didn't get sick. However, the stories around the live vaccine are interesting. Initial trials were successful, but the US government didn't permit further trials, so Sabin ran them in the USSR and East Germany. Over time, Sabin's vaccine became more popular as it could be given orally on a sugar lump rather than as an injection. However, both vaccines are still used today. The polio vaccines have saved countless lives. The disease has all but been eradicated in most of the world, everywhere except Afghanistan and Pakistan. There are occasional outbreaks in other places, especially those that share a border with Afghanistan and Pakistan, but they're generally contained pretty quickly. This led me to wonder, why these countries? There are, of course, lots of reasons. Afghanistan was at the war with the US for 20-odd years, with other conflicts before that. This definitely makes it harder to run vaccination campaigns. But there's another barrier. And that barrier is fear that the vaccines are actually a plot by the CIA. Sounds a bit like a wild conspiracy until you find out that it actually happened. Yep, the CIA really did run a fake vaccination campaign in the region as part of an effort to capture Osama bin Laden. It was hepatitis B they were claiming to vaccinate against rather than polio, but that detail doesn't really matter here. When the information got out, the Taliban banned all vaccines, including polio, in some of the regions they controlled. Not only that, but scared and angry villagers chased workers away, and even worse, 9 workers were murdered. Understandably, the UN had to withdraw its vaccination teams from the region. This makes me so angry. The amount of people, of children, that will suffer because of this is infuriating. It's hard enough to run a vaccination campaign in a war zone and an area with remote mountain villages. Adding in an actual conspiracy to the mix is just so dangerous, and it's dangerous for all of humanity. Vaccines protect us all. Conspiracy theories thrive where there is secrecy and when there is evidence of governments actually doing things like this. It's hard enough to combat misinformation when it doesn't have a basis in fact. When it does, I'm not even sure where you'd start. While there has been some more recent attempts at vaccination, Afghanistan has suspended its house-to-house vaccinating campaign as of September 2024. Area-based campaigns are continuing, but they are more likely to miss people. Health workers are still coming under suspicion and even being murdered in some regions of Afghanistan and Pakistan. And there are still rumours that vaccine campaigns are some part of an anti-Muslim conspiracy. While this is, of course, very worrying, it doesn't mean the region is doomed to ongoing low vaccination rates. There is hope in a story from Nigeria. The country faced similar misinformation about the polio vaccine and also had a heartbreaking incident where several workers were killed. Religious leaders in part of the country called for a boycott of the vaccine, spreading rumours that it may be contaminated and cause infertility or HIV. People were struggling to get access to other medications and medical treatments, so the idea that a free vaccine had an ulterior motive spread easily, as it didn't fit with their other experiences. This was exacerbated by mistrust. The government was trying to limit the number of children people had, and there were also reports that Pfizer had run an illegal drug trial in the region, further damaging trust in the medical establishment. This is all very fertile ground for a conspiracy theory. However, since then, Nigeria has successfully eradicated polio. Part of the strategy was to work with local leaders to spread accurate information and to train local volunteers to educate people and even administer the vaccines so that everything was coming from people they knew and trusted. The religious leaders who had advocated for the boycott were given the opportunity to observe the testing of the vaccine in a neutral but Muslim country to prove it wasn't contaminated. This spread trust and allowed Nigeria to reach the point where there is no more polio. This is a great example of the importance of trust when sharing information and the way that we can change the narrative when we work with people and understand what's going on. Of course, it definitely helped that people in this situation genuinely wanted what was best for their communities and were convinced that the vaccine was safe. Sadly, this is not always the case and makes the situation much more challenging to address. So this loops us back to today. As well as the outbreak in Gaza, polio has been detected in wastewater in Europe. And despite this, RFK Jr.'s lawyer wants to ban the vaccine, claiming it's unsafe. It's not RFK Jr. himself, but that's still a scarily close relationship. I don't know how much more evidence you need that the vaccine is safe. It has worked across the world for over 70 years. They may not have been tested to exactly modern standards when they were developed, because those standards didn't exist, but they've been widely used and reviewed since then. To be fair to RFK Jr., he has said he's all for the polio vaccine. However, given some of the things he has said about the completely discredited theories about other vaccine harms, a lot of people are sceptical. Since I started writing this script, there has been an outbreak of measles in Texas, and an unvaccinated child has sadly died. In addition, a meeting to determine the strains of flu to target with this year's flu vaccine was cancelled. Definitely seems there's some weird stuff going on around vaccines at the highest level of the US government at the moment. Hopefully the rest of the world can fill at least some of those gaps. Now, the medical establishment is not always right. Sometimes it does need to be challenged. Sister Kenny using heat on stricken muscles rather than splints showed us that. However, there is a world of difference between trialling a new treatment and sharing misinformation about an established vaccine. I think a lot of anti-vaccine information has spread because the diseases that the vaccines protect us against are now so rare. Side effects are scary when you don't have the reality of the illness to compare it to. Not to mention, getting vaccines can be painful. And yeah, it does distress babies who don't know why we were doing it. But the alternative, the diseases that these vaccines prevent, are definitely a much worse option. Relative risk can be hard to wrap your head around, so it's worth digging into a bit more. Let's look at measles, for example, since it's in the news. According to the Texas Department of Health Services, about 1 in 5 people who get sick with the measles will need hospital care. 1 in 20 will develop pneumonia. In the recent Texas outbreak, at least 159 people have caught the disease, and 2 have sadly died. Compare this with, in 2019, there were 418 suspected adverse reactions to the measles vaccine in the UK. That's any adverse reaction that was reported. It sounds scary on its own. But the vaccine is routinely given to all children at 1 year old and around 3 years old. So in 2019, that was around 1.5 million children. So that's a 0.0028% chance of an adverse effect compared to 20% chance of needing hospitalisation if you get measles. Looking at it like that, I'm definitely getting the vaccine. Measles is much rarer these days, but that's still a risk I don't want to take. As the outbreak in Texas is showing us, it can still happen. It's very sad and scary for those affected, but I hope, as a kind of silver lining, it changes the story of measles and reminds people of the risks of the disease and the importance of vaccines. This might help people understand this relative risk. Vaccination rates need to be around 90 or 95% for it to protect everyone. So even if it's rare, we still need as many people as possible to be protected. This then, in turn, protects those with compromised immune systems and allergies to vaccines or who are too young to be vaccinated. I do think that another part of the difficulties with some people have with the medical establishment is the story we seem to have in our society that doctors are the smartest of the smart. There does seem to be a narrative that they are an authority above questioning, and a lot of people don't like authority. Yes, doctors are smart, and they do work hard and study hard to qualify, but they are also human. Sometimes doctors do make mistakes. There are various systems and processes in place to limit the risk of this, but no one is perfect. I do trust doctors, but I also ask questions. It is totally reasonable to be informed about your own health and any conditions you have and medications you take. For example, I know someone who researched what would happen if they took too much of a medication they were prescribed and what the risky dose was. They made sure to get that information from a reliable source. It's a sensible thing to know, and in this case, having this information saved their life. They went to accident and emergency, the emergency room, whatever you call it where you're from. They were given the same medication there again, even though they had told staff they were prescribed it and had already taken it. So they refused the medication. This was, technically, going against medical advice, at least the advice of the person in front of them. However, it was also trusting the medical research on the safe dose of the drug. They looked at the evidence in context and made an informed decision. They did their own research. However, they did it in, a methodical way. They didn't give up on the entire medical profession because of this. They also didn't stop taking the medication completely just because someone messed up. I think this is a good example of the balance between medical experts and people being experts on their own body and experience. There are a lot of doctors who don't take their patients' expertise into account. Sadly, this is especially the case when the patient is a woman or a person of colour, or even worse when it's both. I recently came across an image from a medical textbook which contained the false, unevidenced claim that black people feel less pain. And it was recent. Black people experience pain the same as white people because, we're all people. And it's distressing that this myth is still being perpetuated. So yes, some medical professionals do need to trust people more. And we all need to get a bit less squeamish about talking about things. I had a doctor at an appointment ask if the waterworks were okay. It took me a moment to understand what on earth he was talking about. Eventually I got there and assured him that I was not having any problems urinating. No idea how someone who was still learning English would handle that one. I was having enough trouble and it's my native language. Maybe he would have said something different, I don't know. But come on, euphemisms are not helpful in the doctor's surgery. So, of course, not all people who do their own research are understanding the potential risks of a medication they're on and advocating for themselves. Sometimes they mean they sifted through journal articles until they found one that sounded like it agreed with them, or even dismissed all journal articles as being products of Big Pharma and researched via blog posts instead. It does interest me that some people who dismiss Big Pharma and mainstream research are completely willing to believe those who write random blog posts, and especially those who are also selling things. Sure, be skeptical, but be skeptical equally across different sources. Look at all the information critically. Yeah, the peer review journal process isn't perfect. That is why the highest level of evidence is a systematic review, a compilation of multiple studies which looks at the treatment either compared to no treatment or existing treatments, depending on what exactly is being researched. So to return to the story I told earlier of Sister Kenny, she based her treatments on evidence about the effect of heat on muscles. She had a theory, tested it, and compared the outcomes to other treatments. She didn't just do it for one patient, then claim that it was the way to go without examining how it compared to other options. She looked at her findings critically. I think that's my main takeaway here. Look at the evidence critically. It would also help if Big Pharma stopped being dicks. Their history doesn't help their case. Similarly, doctors need to get better at listening to their patients and treating patients as experts in their own bodies. Finally, the CIA needs to stay the fuck out of healthcare. It's incredibly difficult to build trust in genuine health programs when the globe has the history it does and the stories of the CIA running scam programs are true. Whew. This one got me more worked up than I was expecting. But diseases spreading unchecked are scary, and vaccines are so crucial to protecting ourselves and each other. I did go off track a bit from polio, but I hope you came with me on the journey. The stories we tell about who is an expert, who is worth listening to, and who we can trust are all part of this. Understanding these stories help us to understand the world we're living in. As the story of polio vaccines in Nigeria shows, understanding these stories can help people change the narrative. So I think that's a fairly positive note to end on. As with the last episode, my sources are on the website. They didn't fit in the show notes box. So that was fun. And if you have thoughts, drop me an email at ourstoriesandourselves@gmail.com or on Blue Sky at ourstories.bluesky.social. The next episode will be out in 2 weeks' time and will be about the stories I heard in Psych 101 and what they do and don't tell us about why people do the things they do. As I said before, I'm aiming to interview people who tell stories in all sorts of ways. So if that's you or you have an idea for someone to interview, please do reach out. I'm also going to look more at how fiction stories shape us and the world. So stay tuned for future episodes on that. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please subscribe, leave a review, like the video on YouTube, all the algorithm feeding options, or tell your friends, the real life alternative to the algorithm. To round out, a quote from Terry Pratchett that I think fits this episode. There's always a story. It's all stories, really. The sun coming up every day is a story. Everything's got a story in it. Change the story. Change the world.